so we've talked about, we've laid this framework out for the three sphere model. We're going to take,
Yes.
we're going to change that thinking now from, it's not three circles to the three spheres. And it's that, you know, the family evolution that surrounds those three spheres, whether it be family, the ownership and the board, or the management of the company, management within the company. What are the potential consequences for families that ignore, you know, those three circles and aren't paying attention to all sides of, you know, all pieces of the sphere?
Well, Michael, let me start first with philosophy and then move to practice. I always think why matters and then to get to how. All families start in the way that we're discussing it, enterprising families, with one human being doing something very, very unusual. In fact, it should be something that's impossible. That person has a dream, and that dream becomes so manifest for that person that they actually take the energy of the dream. Dreams are energy, they're not matter. And they manifest that dream into matter. That should not be possible for a human being to do. So the first thing we have to understand is that all families that have enterprises of these sorts are not normative. They're not better, they're just not normative. That's the first thing. The second thing is that if that particular individual and another individual have an affinity and create this thing we call family by having future generations, then the question that that family has to consider is why in 3 generations, universally in the world, do the bonds of family fall apart? Why? Well, most of the time it is because the family doesn't have an overriding interest in the growing the affinity. It gets caught in the financial capital. It doesn't grow its human, intellectual, social, and spiritual capitals. So in 3 generations around the world, all different proverbs, the family bonds come apart. Now, the families that don't have that, the families that go beyond the 3rd generation with the bonds intact, where they don't know it, but this is critical. They are deciding when the bonds break. So no family ever can avoid coming apart eventually. That's physics in our universe, second law of thermodynamics, entropy. But every family has free will as to when. Isn't that interesting? Every family has free will as to when. Now, to your question about the 3 sphere model. If we understand, as we do, that each of these spheres is a sphere of energy that emerges from that first action of taking energy and making it matter, and the first action of family, the affinity energy between 2 people. The question is, how do we sustain and grow the energy? How do we create fusion instead of fission or inertia? Well, let's come back to our 3 spheres now. Let's be practical. Well, the first thing is that when we look at the 3 spheres, they look like they're the same size. They aren't. So if I'm that first generation person who took energy and made it matter, my dream, and manifested it, when I look at the 3 spheres, what do I see? I never see family at all.
Right.
It's opaque. I see ownership, but that's me. So I don't see that circle very well. And when I look at it, what I see is a huge sphere around management succession. So when I look at it, I don't see 3 equal spheres at all. Now, if I'm a great-grandchild of a family, great-grandchild, 4th generation, of a family that is intact, what do I see? Management's opaque. I can't see it at all. I have no connection to it. The owner and board sphere is pretty important. I know something about stakeholder ownership either as a trust beneficiary or directly. And I know something about the board because they come and see me. So that circle is pretty big, but the family circle is enormous because now there might be, I don't know, 50 or 60 different sets of complex relationships in the family sphere. So over the 4 generations, the dynamism of the spheres keeps shape shifting depending upon who looks at it. It's almost like, I don't want to get deep into physics, but almost like the law of special relationships that Einstein created, where the train's going by and we all see it differently.
Depends on where you're sitting.
Yeah, or we see through it darkly and something darkly, and maybe later we see more clearly. But the point is that the spheres are constantly shape-shifting as the energy inside of them evolves to match the needs of the overall system that surrounds it. So this is the actual way to imagine and understand the 3-sphere model, that it is constantly dynamically changing, and its relative importance is changing depending upon who's looking at it. So now let me be very direct. If I'm sitting with a dreamer, as I call them, who dreamt a dream that became so large for that person that he or she actually brought it to matter, manifested it. If I talk to them about the family circle sphere or the board and owner sphere, I will get dead eyes. Can't see it. No matter how many times on the pieces of paper all of our listeners and watchers have, and no many times I draw it, all they can see is management succession and a glimpse of owner succession. If I talk to a 2nd generation family member, what they can see is management as relatively important. They begin to see ownership and board as manifesting, and they begin to understand that that family sphere is emerging. And if I talk to a 3rd generation member of an intact family, they will begin to see the family sphere as most important, the board and owner sphere as dependent, and management sphere is shrinking. Now, it isn't that each isn't important. It is simply that these are dynamic spheres that evolve with the evolution of the family and that larger sphere of system energy that surrounds it. Now, I'm apologizing if that's too much but that's actually, Michael, the way it is. And let me say candidly, the terrible damage has been done with this 3-circle model, not 3-sphere model, because it's seen as static. And it isn't seen through the eyes of the person looking at it, depending upon which generation of the intact family of affinity he or she is in when they look at it.
Sure. Again, it goes back to, like you talked about the train, perspective is everything. And that was about the best analogy and description of looking at it from G1 to G2 to G3 to G4. You really need to see it through those different lenses. It's also different if you're a married in. It's
yes. Absolutely.
It's different if you're a member of a family business but not a family member. And so that's a very, very good way of looking at it. The consequences to ignoring those things, goes back to, whether you're growing and flourishing or not. And I would imagine, and tell me if I'm wrong, with the challenge becomes, if I'm only seeing things through my perspective, I may be missing the perspective of others to a detriment.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Really dealing with something as powerful as this model actually is, the first thing one has to do is get rid of one's own subjectivity. Now, that's impossible. I'm not creating something impossible, but the subjective look at this, how do I see it, is fine as long as it is followed by how does everyone else in the system see it. But if it stops with how I see it, terrible damage is going to occur because it fails the great test of Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, if you recall, I wouldn't give a fig for the simple made complex, but I would give everything I own for the complex made simple. Well, if I'm looking at it subjectively only from my own view, I've got the simple looking at something infinitely complex, and I'm in terrible trouble. If I can look at it and say, what is the complexity of this? And how do I now become objective in looking at it? It now becomes incredibly powerful as a positive tool. Now, let me add one more thing quickly here, because I think it's also a part of the system that is opaque. I'm going to quickly touch this. In America and in other common law countries, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, it's very common, Michael, that by the third generation of a family who has significant resources, an enterprising family, it's very common in common law countries that by the third generation of the family, the grandchildren, 90% of the resources are in trust. There's a wave effect. So that founding dreamer has nothing in trust. The children, the second generation, as we refer to it, the rising generation, usually has about 50% in trust because along the way they got some shares, that owner circle begins to appear, and then the estate lawyers and everybody got helping, and then the trust came. So often it's about 50-50 for them, and they create trust too. So by the grandchildren generation, about 90% with a wave of trust is in trust. Now, I'm going to ask our listeners and you to tell me where in the picture that we made does the word trust appear?
You just made it way more complicated.
Yeah, where's the word trust? Did anybody see that in the pictures that they drew?
No.
And yet, there's another family member sneaking in. The trusts are family members. They're not other. They're not something other. They're family members.
Yeah.
They're right in the middle of this system. And in fact, when you look at the owner board circle and you don't write the word trustees in there, and you don't put sort of dotted lines up in the family circle to trusts, the picture is completely incomplete. And in fairness to Mr. Davis and Mr. Taguri, they were trying to describe a business problem, principally, by the way, of evolution of management, because they're business professors. It's only when you get into the complexity of the future of the family's enterprise ownership that you begin to realize that you have family members who aren't identified in the picture. But boy, are they important.
Sure. They each have their own unique tax ID number. And thus,
yes,
according to the US, IRS, right, they are a part of the family. That's interesting. I have, again, always enlightening when we talk. I learn something every time.
Well, I'm only showing my scars today, my old facial scars at 78 years old, of what I didn't know when I first started studying this model. But I have to